The room went silent the moment Rachel picked up my dinner plate. She didn't slam it down. She didn't yell. She simply placed it onto a cheap paper tray, smiled across the Christmas table, and said, "From now on, you'll eat in the garage. It'll make things easier for everyone." Nobody laughed. Nobody objected. 8 people sat around that table, but the only sound was the Christmas music playing softly from the living room. I looked at my son first. Daniel never raised his head. He kept slicing the turkey, as if he hadn't heard a single word. My 7-year-old granddaughter, Lily, stared at me with wide eyes, waiting for someone to say it was a joke. No one did. Rachel gently slid the paper tray toward me. "The baby's nursery is almost finished. We need to keep the dining room cleaner from now on." It wasn't about cleanliness. We both knew that. I looked at the oak dining table I'd built with my own hands nearly 30 years earlier. Every scratch on its surface had a memory attached to it. Every Christmas, every birthday, every Thanksgiving had happened right there. Tonight, for the first time, there was no chair waiting for me. I stood without saying a word, picked up the tray, and walked toward the garage. Behind me, conversation slowly resumed, almost as if nothing unusual had happened. The garage was cold enough that I could see my breath. A folding chair stood beside an old workbench, with a plastic table just large enough for one plate. Someone had already arranged it before dinner. That told me everything. This hadn't been an impulsive insult. It had been planned. I set the tray down but didn't touch the food. Through the thin door separating the garage from the kitchen, I could hear glasses clinking and people wishing each other Merry Christmas. Then I heard Rachel's voice, calm, relaxed, completely confident. "See?" she said. "That wasn't so hard." Someone chuckled. Daniel didn't. His voice came a few seconds later, lower than everyone else's. "Maybe we should have waited until after the holidays," Rachel answered immediately. "The longer we wait, the harder it'll be." I stepped closer to the door without making a sound. "He's already accepted it," Rachel continued. "People his age hate confrontation. Tomorrow will be even easier." Daniel sighed. "I still don't feel right about this." Rachel laughed softly. "You will when this house finally belongs to us." The paper plate almost slipped from my hand. "My house?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Finally, he asked, "Are you sure the paperwork will work?" Rachel didn't hesitate. "Relax. He trusts you." "That's all we need." The conversation stopped as someone changed the subject, but I had already heard enough. I quietly stepped away from the door before anyone noticed I was listening. For the first time that evening, I looked around the garage instead of at the food. My old fishing gear had been pushed into one corner. Several family photo albums were stacked beside paint cans. Mary's rocking chair, the one she'd spent every Christmas morning sitting in while watching the grandchildren open presents, was covered with moving blankets. They weren't just moving me out of the dining room. They were slowly erasing every trace of the life we had built in this house. I walked over and pulled one blanket away. A framed photograph fell onto the floor. It was the last Christmas Mary was alive. She was smiling, flour on her cheek after baking cookies with Lily. Daniel stood behind her with one arm around both of us. Rachel wasn't in that picture yet. I picked it up carefully, brushing away the dust with my sleeve. "Merry Christmas," I whispered. My voice cracked before I finished the sentence. A gentle knock interrupted my thoughts. I quickly slipped the photograph under my coat just before the garage door opened a few inches. Lily peeked inside, holding a Christmas cookie shaped like a little house. She looked around to make sure no one was watching before running over to me. "Grandpa," she whispered, placing the cookie into my hand. "Grandma always said nobody should eat alone on Christmas." I couldn't speak. I simply hugged her. Before I could thank her, Rachel's voice echoed from inside the house. "Lily, where are you?" Lily squeezed my hand one last time and hurried back inside. The garage door closed again, leaving me alone with the cookie and the old photograph. I looked at the tiny icing roof on the cookie, then at the picture of Mary smiling on our front porch years earlier. Something inside me changed. Until that night, I had been trying to keep peace in the family. But peace built on humiliation isn't peace at all. I folded the photograph, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and walked toward the old steel toolbox hidden beneath the workbench. There was something inside that Rachel didn't know existed. And before another Christmas passed in that house, I intended to find out exactly why she believed it would soon belong to her. I didn't confront Rachel the next morning. That was exactly what she expected. Instead, I left the house before sunrise, carrying nothing but my old leather briefcase and the photograph of Mary tucked inside the front pocket. The streets were almost empty. Christmas lights still glowed on quiet front porches, while most families were asleep after the holiday. I drove 20 minutes across town and parked in front of a brick building I hadn't visited in nearly 10 years. The brass sign on the door still read, Richard Coleman, attorney at law. Richard looked older than I remembered, but the sharpness in his eyes hadn't changed. He smiled when he saw me, then frowned the moment he realized I was carrying a briefcase. Harold, he said, shaking my hand, people don't bring briefcases to old friends unless something's wrong. I gave a tired smile. I wish you were wrong. 10 minutes later, every original document connected to my house lay across his conference table. Richard examined each page carefully before opening the county's online property database. Neither of us spoke while he compared the originals with the digital records. Suddenly, he stopped scrolling. That's odd. My stomach tightened. What? Richard turned the monitor toward me. Someone submitted an electronic ownership modification request 3 weeks ago. I stared at the screen. I never signed anything. I know. He enlarged the filing and pointed at the electronic signature. At first glance, it looks convincing. He placed my original signature beside the digital copy. But whoever forged this missed one detail. He handed me a magnifying glass. Look at the last letter. I studied both signatures for several seconds before noticing it. The forged signature ended with a perfectly straight line. Mine always curved slightly upward because of an old wrist injury from my construction days. Richard leaned back slowly. This wasn't rejected because someone caught the forgery. He tapped another section of the screen. It was rejected because one supporting document was missing. I looked up. Meaning, whoever filed this believes they still have another chance. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Richard asked quietly, "Who has access to your personal paperwork?" I answered without hesitation, "Daniel." Saying my son's name out loud felt heavier than I expected. Richard nodded, but didn't comment. Before he could ask another question, my phone began vibrating across the table. Rachel. I ignored it. She called again almost immediately. Then came a text message. "Harold, please answer. Daniel is worried. You left without telling anyone." A second message appeared before I even finished reading the first. "I'm afraid your memory is getting worse. Please come home so we can help you." Richard quietly slid the phone back toward me. "Notice what she didn't ask?" I frowned. "She never asked where you went." He paused. "She already knows you're doing something she doesn't want you to do." Before I could respond, the receptionist knocked lightly on the office door. "Mr. Coleman," she said, sounding uncertain. "There's a woman here asking for Mr. Thompson." Richard glanced toward the hallway. "Did she give her name?" "Rachel Thompson." My heartbeat slowed. She hadn't called to find me. She had tracked me. Richard looked at me calmly. "Did you tell anyone you were coming here?" "No." "Good." He gathered every original document, placed them into a fireproof safe behind his desk, and locked it before saying, "Whatever happens next, don't lose your temper." A moment later, Rachel appeared at the office door carrying 2 coffees and wearing the same warm smile she always showed strangers. "There you are," she said cheerfully. "We've been worried sick." She handed 1 coffee to the receptionist before turning toward Richard. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. Harold has been forgetting things lately, and when he disappeared this morning, we were terrified." Richard remained seated. "Mrs. Thompson, your father-in-law seems to know exactly where he is." Rachel laughed softly. "That's the difficult part. Some days he's perfectly clear. Other days." She let the sentence hang unfinished. I looked directly at her for the first time that morning. "Rachel," she smiled. "Yes? Why are you telling people I'm losing my memory?" The smile remained, but her eyes changed. "Because I'm worried about you." I reached into my jacket and slowly placed Mary's photograph on Richard's desk. "Then tell me something." Rachel folded her arms. "Anything." I looked from the photograph to her face. "If you're so worried about me." I paused, just long enough for the room to become completely silent. "Why did someone try to transfer my house 3 weeks ago using a forged signature?" Rachel didn't answer. For the first time since she walked into the office, the smile disappeared completely. Richard didn't say a word. He simply watched her. So did I. And in that long, uncomfortable silence, Rachel made the mistake she'd been avoiding all morning. Instead of asking what I was talking about, she looked toward the safe behind Richard's desk. She wasn't worried about me anymore. She was worried about the documents she thought were inside. Rachel recovered so quickly that if I hadn't spent 40 years negotiating construction contracts, I might have believed her performance. She looked at the document on Richard's desk for barely a second before smiling again. Harold, I honestly have no idea what this is. Richard calmly slid the paper back into the folder. That's fine. The county keeps the submission records. Whoever filed it left a digital trail. Rachel laughed softly. Then I'm sure they'll find whoever did it. She turned toward me, her voice becoming warm again. Can we please go home now? Daniel is worried about you. I stood without raising my voice. I'm staying a little longer. The smile on her face faded just enough for me to notice. You're making this much bigger than it needs to be. I met her eyes. Maybe. Or maybe someone already has. For the first time, Rachel didn't answer immediately. She picked up her purse, nodded politely to Richard, and walked out. Through the office window, I watched her step into the parking lot. Instead of getting into her SUV, she immediately pulled out her phone and began speaking quickly, pacing back and forth with obvious frustration. Richard quietly joined me at the window. She's not calling your son, he said. She's calling someone who's part of the problem. Before I could respond, my own phone vibrated. Daniel, I answered. Dad, where are you? His voice sounded nervous. Still with Richard. There was a long pause before he spoke again. Can you come home? Please. Rachel says everything's getting out of control. I looked at Rachel through the glass. She was still on the phone, waving her free hand as if arguing with someone. I'll be there soon, I replied before hanging up. Richard locked my original property documents inside his office safe and handed me a business card. Don't carry the originals anymore. If someone is desperate enough to forge paperwork, they may become desperate enough to take the real documents. I slipped the card into my wallet and drove home. Daniel was waiting alone in the driveway. The moment I stepped out of my truck, he walked toward me. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept all night. Dad, he hesitated. I'm sorry about yesterday. It wasn't a complete apology, but it was the first crack I'd seen in months. Where's Rachel? I asked. She went out. Shopping? Daniel nodded uncertainly. That's what she said. I looked at the empty driveway where her SUV should have been. The day after Christmas wasn't when Rachel usually shopped. Something told me she was somewhere else, fixing whatever had gone wrong after leaving Richard's office. We walked inside together. The house felt strangely quiet without her. Daniel poured 2 cups of coffee before sitting across from me at the kitchen table. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked up. Dad, do you really think Rachel would try to take your house? I didn't answer his question. Instead, I asked one of my own. Has she ever asked you to sign documents without reading every page? Daniel frowned. Why? Just answer. He stared into his coffee. There were refinancing papers a few weeks ago. My heartbeat slowed. Who prepared them? Rachel said the bank handled everything. Did you read them? He shook his head slowly. Not really. Did I sign anything? No. Then who signed? Daniel looked confused. I did. The room became completely silent. Rachel said she already talked to you about it. I looked at my son for a long moment. His expression wasn't guilty. It was frightened. He honestly believed he'd done something normal. Before I could ask another question, the front door opened. Rachel walked inside carrying several shopping bags. The moment she saw Daniel and me sitting together, she stopped walking. It lasted only a second before another perfect smile appeared. Good, she said cheerfully. You two finally had your father-son talk. Daniel stood. Rachel, I told Dad about the refinance papers. She set the bags on the counter without looking at him. Of course you did. He says he never approved any refinance. Rachel laughed lightly. Because he forgot. I slowly stood from my chair. No. The room fell silent again. I didn't forget, I said calmly. It never happened. Rachel folded her arms. Harold, we've already talked about your memory. Then show me the paperwork. The bank has it. Which bank? I'd have to check. Call them. Her smile disappeared completely. I'm not doing this. I took one step closer. Why not? Rachel's voice suddenly became sharp. Because I'm tired of being treated like a criminal for trying to help this family. Daniel looked at her, surprised by the outburst. Rachel, she turned toward him immediately. Tell your father I'm trying to protect him. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he quietly asked, Can we just get copies of the papers? Rachel froze. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked at Daniel as though he had betrayed her. You don't trust me either? She whispered. Daniel hesitated. That hesitation was all it took. Rachel spun around, rushed upstairs, and slammed the bedroom door so hard the picture frames shook on the wall. Less than a minute later, I heard drawers opening and cabinet doors banging. Daniel looked toward the ceiling. What's she doing? I didn't answer. We both listened. Then hurried footsteps came racing down the stairs. Rachel appeared again, clutching a small black metal lockbox tightly against her chest. The moment she saw both of us watching, she stopped. She hadn't expected us to still be standing there. Without saying another word, she walked straight past us, out the front door, and locked the box inside her SUV. At that moment, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever Rachel feared, losing most, wasn't in the house anymore. It was inside that box. Rachel didn't mention the lockbox again that night. Instead, she acted as though nothing had happened. She cooked dinner, laughed with Lily, even asked if I wanted another cup of coffee. That frightened me more than her anger ever had. People become dangerous when they stop fighting openly. They start planning. The next morning, Daniel knocked on my garage door before sunrise. He looked exhausted. Dad, Rachel wants all of us to go to the memory clinic today. I looked up from the old photograph of Mary I had been holding. The independent doctor? Daniel hesitated. No, another one. My stomach tightened. Richard's warning echoed in my head. Never let the other side choose the battlefield. 20 minutes later, we arrived at a private neurological clinic on the other side of town. The lobby looked more like a luxury hotel than a medical office. Rachel greeted the receptionist by her first name. Good morning, Kelly. Kelly smiled back immediately. Mrs. Thompson, the doctor is expecting you. I noticed the word you, not Mr. Thompson. Rachel had been here before. A nurse handed Daniel several forms to sign while Rachel quietly pulled the doctor into a nearby office. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. He gets confused, paranoid, refuses financial advice. She was building a case before I had even met the physician. 40 minutes later, I sat across from Dr. Warren. He asked routine questions about dates, addresses, current events, and basic memory exercises. I answered every one without hesitation. Halfway through the evaluation, he smiled politely. Mr. Thompson, you're doing very well. Relief began to settle over me. Then the door opened. Rachel walked inside carrying a folder nearly 2 inches thick. Doctor, she said apologetically, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I forgot to give you these. Doctor. Warren accepted the folder. Inside were printed emails, handwritten notes, photographs, and short video clips. Rachel explained calmly, These are examples of Harold forgetting conversations, accusing family members of stealing from him, and becoming increasingly suspicious. Doctor. Warren watched several short videos on his tablet. One showed me standing in the garage asking where my old filing cabinet keys had gone. Another showed me arguing about documents. A third captured me saying, Someone is trying to take this house. Out of context, every clip made me look unstable. I looked at Rachel in disbelief. You recorded me? She didn't even blink. Because I love you, Doctor. Warren remained professional, but I noticed something change in his expression. He wasn't convinced I had dementia, but he was no longer certain I was completely fine either. That tiny crack was all Rachel needed. An hour later, the doctor invited all 3 of us into his office. He folded his hands before speaking. Mr. Thompson performed well on today's cognitive testing. Rachel's shoulders dropped slightly. Then the doctor continued. However, Daniel looked up immediately. Given the family reports and the behavioral recordings, he paused carefully. I believe additional observation would be appropriate before making any final conclusions. My heart sank. It wasn't a diagnosis, but it wasn't the clean result I had hoped for either. Rachel quietly lowered her eyes as though she were trying not to cry. Doctor, I just want him to be safe. Daniel reached over and squeezed her hand. For the first time since this nightmare began, he believed her again. We left the clinic in complete silence. During the drive home, Daniel finally spoke. Dad, maybe Rachel isn't trying to hurt you. I stared out the passenger window. Do you believe those videos? He hesitated. I I don't know what to believe anymore. Those words hurt more than being sent to eat in the garage. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I realized Rachel had accomplished exactly what she wanted. She hadn't defeated me in court. She hadn't stolen the house. She had done something much worse. She had placed doubt inside my own son's heart again. That evening, after everyone went to bed, I quietly called Richard and told him everything. There was a long silence on the other end before he finally spoke. Harold. His voice had become unusually serious. I was afraid she'd do this. Do what? I asked. Richard took a slow breath. If the doctor relied on edited videos before reviewing the evidence. He paused. We're no longer dealing with a family dispute. I frowned. Then what are we dealing with? Richard answered with 7 words that made my blood run cold. Someone coached her before she ever met you. Richard asked me only one question after I finished describing everything that had happened at the clinic. Did the doctor ever ask to see the original videos? I leaned back in my chair, replaying every minute of the appointment in my mind. Slowly, I realized the answer. No. Richard didn't say anything for several seconds. Then he spoke in the calm voice he always used when the situation was worse than it first appeared. Harold, edited clips can tell any story the editor wants them to tell. We don't need to prove you were right. We only need to prove those videos were manipulated. Early the next morning, I drove to Richard's office before anyone else in the house was awake. He was already waiting with another woman I had never met. This is Susan Miller, Richard said. She's a digital forensic analyst. She spent 25 years authenticating electronic evidence for state courts. Susan shook my hand before placing a laptop on the conference table. Mr. Thompson, if Rachel recorded those videos with her phone, every original file contains hidden information timestamps, editing history, and device data. If she altered anything, there's a good chance we can prove it. Hope returned for the first time since leaving the clinic. The problem is, I said quietly, we don't have the original files. Susan smiled slightly. Maybe Rachel does. Before I could ask what she meant, Richard's office phone rang. He answered, listened for nearly a minute, then covered the receiver with his hand. Harold, that's Daniel. My heart tightened immediately. Richard handed me the phone. Dad. Daniel sounded exhausted. Can you come home? Right now. What's happened? Rachel packed 2 suitcases. I stood instantly. Is she leaving? There was a long pause before Daniel answered. No. His voice dropped to a whisper. She says she's taking Lily to stay with her parents until this is over. My chest felt heavy. Put Lily on the phone. I can't. Why not? Another silence. Then Daniel quietly admitted, Rachel won't let me. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the driveway. Rachel was loading luggage into her SUV, while Lily stood beside the garage holding her stuffed rabbit. She looked frightened and confused. The moment Lily saw me, she tried to run over. Rachel immediately grabbed her shoulder. Stay here. I walked toward them calmly. Where are you taking her? Rachel didn't even look at me. Somewhere peaceful. Lily belongs with her father. Rachel finally turned. Lily belongs somewhere she doesn't have to watch an old man destroy this family. Daniel stepped out of the front door. Rachel, don't do this. She ignored him. Instead, she opened the back door of the SUV and helped Lily climb inside. The little girl rolled down the window before Rachel could close the door completely. Tears filled her eyes. Grandpa, she whispered. Are you coming too? I forced a smile, even though it hurt. Not today, sweetheart. Lily looked down at the stuffed rabbit in her lap. Mom says you're sick. The words hit me harder than anything Rachel had done so far. Before I could answer, Rachel shut the window. Enough. She walked around to the driver's side. Daniel moved in front of the SUV. You're not taking my daughter anywhere until we talk. Rachel slammed on the brakes even though the vehicle hadn't moved. Move. No. Move, Daniel. Not until you tell me the truth. Rachel stepped out of the SUV, furious. The truth? She shouted. The truth is, your father has turned you against your own wife. Daniel shook his head. No. His voice remained calm. Your lies are doing that. Rachel stared at him in disbelief. Then she did something neither of us expected. She reached into her purse, pulled out a folded document, and threw it onto the hood of the SUV. Fine, she yelled. Read it. Daniel unfolded the paper. His face immediately turned pale. This. He looked at her in shock. This is a temporary guardianship petition. Rachel folded her arms. The attorney said if the doctor expressed concern, we could file immediately. I stepped closer. You already prepared it? She didn't answer. Daniel kept reading. Halfway down the page, his hands began to shake. Rachel, he whispered, this petition says Dad is incapable of making financial decisions. He turned another page. And it asks the court to appoint you as guardian before any hearing takes place. Rachel realized she had revealed too much. She reached for the document, but Daniel stepped back. At that exact moment, Susan Miller's words echoed in my mind. Edited clips can tell any story. I suddenly understood why Rachel had rushed to the clinic, why she had shown the videos before the examination was finished, and why she already had a guardianship petition prepared. This had never been about my health. The medical evaluation was only the first step of a much larger plan. As Rachel stood frozen in the driveway, another vehicle slowly pulled up to the curb. Richard stepped out, followed by Susan carrying a hard-sided equipment case. Rachel's eyes widened the instant she recognized neither of them had come alone. Susan looked directly at the phone sticking out of Rachel's coat pocket and calmly said, Mrs. Thompson, before you delete anything, I'd like to ask you one question. Rachel instinctively reached for her phone. Susan smiled. Thank you, she said quietly. That reaction just told me exactly where the original videos still are. Rachel's hand froze halfway to her phone. For the first time since she'd entered my life, there wasn't a clever answer waiting behind her smile. Susan Miller didn't move any closer. She simply stood beside Richard, watching Rachel with the quiet patience of someone who had spent decades waiting for guilty people to make the next mistake. Daniel looked between them in confusion. Dad, who is she? Before I could answer, Richard stepped forward. Susan is a certified digital forensic examiner. Courts ask her to determine whether electronic evidence has been altered. Rachel immediately laughed, but it sounded forced. This is unbelievable. Now you're bringing strangers to accuse me of editing family videos? Susan finally spoke. I'm not accusing you of anything. She paused. Not yet. Rachel folded her arms. Then leave my property. I quietly corrected her. My property. She shot me a furious look but ignored the comment. Susan remained calm. Mrs. Thompson, yesterday you showed a physician several short video clips to support a claim that Mr. Thompson suffers from cognitive decline. I'd simply like to examine the original files. Rachel answered instantly. I deleted them. Susan nodded, as though she'd expected exactly that response. Interesting. Rachel frowned. Why? Because 2 minutes ago, when I mentioned your phone, your first instinct was to protect it. Susan smiled faintly. People rarely protect something they've already deleted. Daniel slowly turned toward his wife. Rachel, she cut him off. Don't start. Did you edit those videos? No. Then let her examine the phone. Rachel's expression hardened. Absolutely not. Daniel took one step closer. Why? Because it's my private phone. Those videos were used to convince a doctor my father couldn't make his own decisions. Daniel's voice was firmer than I'd heard in years. They're not private anymore. Rachel looked at him in disbelief. You're choosing him over me? Daniel didn't answer. That silence hurt Rachel more than any accusation. She looked around as if searching for someone who still believed her. There was no one. Even little Lily stood quietly on the front porch, clutching her stuffed rabbit and watching the adults with frightened eyes. Rachel suddenly grabbed her car keys. We're leaving. She reached for the SUV door, but Daniel stepped in front of it. No, move. Not until you answer one question. Rachel glared at him. What? Daniel swallowed hard. Did you ever love me? He paused, struggling to finish the sentence. Or did you only love this house? The question hung in the cold afternoon air. Rachel stared at him for several seconds before looking away. She never answered. That was answer enough. Daniel slowly stepped aside, not because he had given up, but because he finally understood the truth. Rachel climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door. The engine roared to life. She backed out of the driveway so quickly that gravel sprayed across the lawn. Lily burst into tears. Mom, she cried, running toward the street. I caught her before she reached the road. Rachel never looked back. We watched the SUV disappear around the corner. Daniel stood motionless, staring after it. She's gone, he whispered. Richard quietly shook his head. No. Daniel looked at him. Richard's voice remained calm. She didn't run. because she was innocent. She ran because she realized the story she'd built is falling apart. Susan looked down at the fresh tire tracks Rachel had left in the driveway. She's also carrying the most important evidence in this case. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. Then we've lost. Susan closed the hard case she had been carrying. Not necessarily. She looked toward me. Mr. Thompson, did Rachel ever send any of those videos to anyone? I thought for a moment. Then I remembered the clinic. She emailed them to Dr. Warren. Susan smiled for the first time. Good. Daniel frowned. Why does that matter? Because deleting a file from a phone doesn't delete every copy. She opened her case and removed a folder. The clinic almost certainly received the original digital files. If they preserved the attachments, the metadata is still intact. Richard looked at me, which means we may not need Rachel's phone at all. Hope returned, but only for a moment. My phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. I answered. Mr. Thompson? A man's voice asked. Yes, this is Detective Brian Collins with the County Sheriff's Office. My heart immediately tightened. How can I help you? There was a brief pause before he spoke again. Actually, his voice became noticeably more serious. I'm calling because your daughter-in-law arrived here less than 10 minutes ago. I looked at Richard, then at Daniel. Why would she go to the sheriff's office? The detective answered before I could ask another question. She's filing a formal complaint against you. The drive to the sheriff's office felt longer than it actually was. No one spoke. Daniel stared out the passenger window, replaying the last few hours in his mind, while Richard sat quietly beside me, reading the temporary guardianship petition Rachel had accidentally exposed. Susan followed us in her own car. The only sound inside my truck was the heater struggling against the cold December air. As we pulled into the parking lot, I saw Rachel's SUV already parked near the entrance. She wasn't leaving. She was waiting. That alone told me this wasn't an emotional outburst. It was another move in a plan she had prepared long before Christmas. Detective Brian Collins met us in the lobby. He looked to be in his early 50s, calm, professional, and completely unreadable. Mr. Thompson? I nodded. He shook my hand before looking at everyone else. Mrs. Thompson filed a complaint about 30 minutes ago. Daniel immediately stepped forward. What kind of complaint? Collins didn't answer right away. Instead, he led us into a private interview room and closed the door. Then he opened a folder lying on the table. She alleges that you've become mentally unstable, threatened her safety, attempted to intimidate her into giving up financial records, and are trying to manipulate your family into believing she's committing fraud. Daniel looked stunned. She said that? Collins nodded. She also requested an emergency protective order preventing you from contacting her or her daughter until the court reviews the situation. My chest tightened. Rachel hadn't just attacked me anymore. She had separated me from Lily. Daniel stood so quickly, his chair nearly tipped over. That's a lie. Collins calmly looked at him. You're willing to state that officially? Daniel hesitated. For several painful seconds, he looked toward the door, as if expecting Rachel to walk in. The old Daniel, the husband who avoided conflict, was still fighting inside him. Rachel knew him well enough to count on that hesitation. She had won again. Richard quietly placed one hand on Daniel's shoulder. The truth doesn't become easier by waiting. Daniel slowly sat back down. He took a deep breath before looking directly at the detective. Everything my wife told you about my father is false. Collins didn't react. He simply made a note in his file. Can you explain why you believe that? Daniel swallowed hard. Because I helped her without realizing what she was doing. The room fell completely silent. Daniel lowered his head. She asked me to sign refinance documents. She said they were routine. I never read them. He paused, ashamed. Then she recorded my father without his knowledge, edited those videos, and showed them to a doctor to make him look mentally incompetent. Collins looked toward Susan. Can any of that be verified? Susan opened her laptop. Not yet. But I believe it can. She explained how metadata, email attachments, and original file structures could reveal whether the videos had been edited before reaching the clinic. Collins listened carefully before closing the folder Rachel had submitted. Mrs. Thompson never mentioned any of that. Richard leaned forward. Because if she did, she'd have to surrender the original files. Before Collins could respond, another deputy knocked on the door and quietly handed him a sealed envelope. Collins opened it, scanned the first page, and frowned. That's fast, Richard asked. What is it? Collins looked directly at me. The court just denied Mrs. Thompson's request for an emergency protective order. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Rachel's first attempt had failed, but Collins wasn't finished. However, he slid another document across the table. The judge has scheduled an expedited hearing 48 hours from now to determine whether a temporary financial guardian should be appointed. I looked down at the notice. Rachel had lost the emergency order, but she'd succeeded in pulling me into court, exactly where she'd wanted this fight to go. Richard quietly whispered, "She doesn't need to win today." He looked at the hearing date. "She only needs to create enough doubt before Friday." Collins stood and buttoned his jacket. "There's one more thing." He opened the interview room door. "Mrs. Thompson insisted on leaving one piece of evidence with us before she left. A deputy carried in a flash drive sealed inside an evidence bag. Collins placed it on the table. "She claims this contains every recording proving your cognitive decline." Susan stared at the evidence bag for several seconds before smiling faintly. "No," she said quietly. Everyone looked at her. Susan pointed at the label attached to the flash drive. "This wasn't uploaded from a phone." She looked at Richard, then at me. "Someone copied these files using a computer." Richard immediately understood. "Meaning there's another device." Susan nodded once. "If these videos were transferred through a computer." She closed her laptop and looked toward Daniel. "Then, somewhere, Rachel has a laptop that still contains everything she never intended anyone else to see." The drive to the sheriff's office felt longer than it actually was. No one spoke. Daniel stared out the passenger window, replaying the last few hours in his mind, while Richard sat quietly beside me reading the temporary guardianship petition Rachel had accidentally exposed. Susan followed us in her own car. The only sound inside my truck was the heater struggling against the cold December air. As we pulled into the parking lot, I saw Rachel's SUV already parked near the entrance. She wasn't leaving. She was waiting. That alone told me this wasn't an emotional outburst. It was another move in a plan she had prepared long before Christmas. Detective Brian Collins met us in the lobby. He looked to be in his early 50s, calm, professional, and completely unreadable. "Mr. Thompson?" I nodded. He shook my hand before looking at everyone else. "Mrs. Thompson filed a complaint about 30 minutes ago." Daniel immediately stepped forward. "What kind of complaint?" Collins didn't answer right away. Instead, he led us into a private interview room and closed the door. Then he opened a folder lying on the table. "She alleges that you've become mentally unstable, threatened her safety, attempted to intimidate her into giving up financial records, and are trying to manipulate your family into believing she's committing fraud." Daniel looked stunned. "She said that?" Collins nodded. "She also requested an emergency protective order, preventing you from contacting her or her daughter until the court reviews the situation." My chest tightened. Rachel hadn't just attacked me anymore. She had separated me from Lily. Daniel stood so quickly, his chair nearly tipped over. "That's a lie." Collins calmly looked at him. "You're willing to state that officially?" Daniel hesitated. For several painful seconds, he looked toward the door, as if expecting Rachel to walk in. The old Daniel, the husband who avoided conflict, was still fighting inside him. Rachel knew him well enough to count on that hesitation. She had won again. Richard quietly placed one hand on Daniel's shoulder. "The truth doesn't become easier by waiting." Daniel slowly sat back down. He took a deep breath before looking directly at the detective. "Everything my wife told you about my father is false." Collins didn't react. He simply made a note in his file. "Can you explain why you believe that?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Because I helped her without realizing what she was doing." The room fell completely silent. Daniel lowered his head. "She asked me to sign refinance documents. She said they were routine. I never read them." He paused, ashamed. "Then she recorded my father without his knowledge, edited those videos, and showed them to a doctor to make him look mentally incompetent." Collins looked toward Susan. "Can any of that be verified?" Susan opened her laptop. "Not yet. But I believe it can." She explained how metadata, email attachments, and original file structures could reveal whether the videos had been edited before reaching the clinic. Collins listened carefully before closing the folder Rachel had submitted. "Mrs. Thompson never mentioned any of that." Richard leaned forward. "Because if she did, she'd have to surrender the original files." Before Collins could respond, another deputy knocked on the door and quietly handed him a sealed envelope. Collins opened it, scanned the first page, and frowned. "That's fast," Richard asked. "What is it?" Collins looked directly at me. "The court just denied Mrs. Thompson's request for an emergency protective order." Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Rachel's first attempt had failed. But Collins wasn't finished. However, he slid another document across the table. "The judge has scheduled an expedited hearing 48 hours from now to determine whether a temporary financial guardian should be appointed." I looked down at the notice. Rachel had lost the emergency order, but she'd succeeded in pulling me into court, exactly where she'd wanted this fight to go. Richard quietly whispered, "She doesn't need to win today." He looked at the hearing date. "She only needs to create enough doubt before Friday." Collins stood and buttoned his jacket. "There's one more thing." He opened the interview room door. "Mrs. Thompson insisted on leaving one piece of evidence with us before she left. A deputy carried in a flash drive sealed inside an evidence bag." Collins placed it on the table. "She claims this contains every recording proving your cognitive decline." Susan stared at the evidence bag for several seconds before smiling faintly. "No," she said quietly. Everyone looked at her. Susan pointed at the label attached to the flash drive. This wasn't uploaded from a phone. She looked at Richard, then at me. "Someone copied these files using a computer." Richard immediately understood. "Meaning, there's another device." Susan nodded once. "If these videos were transferred through a computer." She closed her laptop and looked toward Daniel. "Then somewhere, Rachel has a laptop that still contains everything she never intended anyone else to see." Susan barely slept that night. By sunrise, she was already sitting inside the digital forensics laboratory with Rachel's damaged laptop connected to specialized recovery equipment. Detective Collins stood behind her with a cup of untouched coffee, while Richard, Daniel, and I watched through the observation window. Nobody spoke. Every few minutes, another progress bar crept across the monitor. Finally, Susan leaned back and smiled for the first time since this investigation began. "We've got it." Collins immediately walked over. "The hard drive?" Susan nodded. "Not everything survived, but enough." She opened a recovered folder labeled Personal Archive. Inside were dozens of subfolders organized by date. One folder immediately caught everyone's attention. Harold, Evidence. Daniel stared at the screen in disbelief. She actually named a folder after Dad? Susan opened it. Hundreds of files appeared. Videos, audio recordings, scanned documents, photographs. Most shocking of all was another folder labeled Edited Versions. Susan clicked it. The room became completely silent. She opened one video the doctor had watched during Harold's examination. The original recording showed Harold standing in the garage asking, "Has anyone seen my filing cabinet key?" Rachel answered from behind the camera, "I moved it into the kitchen drawer yesterday." Harold smiled and thanked her before walking away. Susan then opened the version Rachel had shown Dr. Warren. The first half of the conversation had been deleted. The video now began with Harold asking, "Where's my key?" followed immediately by Rachel saying nothing, while the recording ended with Harold looking confused. Daniel slowly covered his face with both hands. She made him look like he couldn't remember anything. Susan quietly nodded. And that's only the first file. One by one, every video told the same story. Conversations had been shortened, dates had been removed, audio had been rearranged, harmless moments had been transformed into evidence of cognitive decline. Collins looked toward Richard. "This is deliberate evidence fabrication," Richard answered calmly. "Exactly." Susan continued searching the recovered files. Suddenly she stopped again. "Wait." She opened another folder labeled Financial Plan. Inside were scanned copies of refinance applications, draft guardianship petitions, property valuation reports, and handwritten checklists. At the top of one document, Rachel had typed a timeline. Step 1, isolate Harold. Step 2, medical evaluation. Step 3, temporary guardian. Step 4, complete refinance. Step 5, sell property after 6 months. Daniel looked physically ill. "She planned everything," he whispered, before she even moved Dad into the garage. Collins photographed every page before sealing the recovered drive as evidence. This changes the entire investigation. Before anyone could respond, Susan opened one final folder. It contained dozens of family photographs. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then she noticed a scanned birthday card written by Mary only months before she died. She enlarged it. Inside, Mary had written to Harold, "If I'm not here one day, promise me you'll never let anyone convince you that this house is worth more than the people inside it." I couldn't stop staring at Mary's handwriting. Daniel quietly walked over and stood beside me. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Dad." Tears filled his eyes. She knew. I nodded slowly. "Your mother saw things I refused to see." Daniel lowered his head, "And I failed both of you." I placed one hand on his shoulder. "Then stop failing today." He looked at me. For the first time in years, I saw the son Mary and I had raised, instead of the frightened husband Rachel had controlled. He took a slow breath before turning toward Detective Collins. "I want to make a full statement." Collins nodded once. "Under oath?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Under oath." Richard quietly smiled. This wasn't just another witness. This was the person Rachel had built her entire plan around. Without Daniel, her explanation collapsed. Collins gathered the evidence into sealed containers and looked toward everyone in the room. "I'll be requesting additional charges this afternoon." Just then, another investigator entered, carrying a printed report. "Detective." He handed Collins the document. "The district attorney has already reviewed the recovered files." Collins scanned the first page before looking up. The court moved faster than expected. Richard frowned. "What happened?" Collins folded the report and looked directly at me. "The judge has scheduled the first hearing for tomorrow morning." He paused before delivering the final sentence. "And Rachel Thompson has been ordered to appear in court with every remaining financial record in her possession." The courtroom was already full before the judge entered. Neighbors, reporters, and several older couples from our community quietly filled the gallery. Word had spread quickly that the hearing wasn't simply about an elderly man and his daughter-in-law anymore. It had become a case about financial abuse against a senior citizen. Rachel arrived wearing a dark blue suit, her hair perfectly styled, looking exactly like the calm, caring woman everyone had believed for years. If someone had walked into that courtroom without knowing the facts, they would have assumed she was the victim. Daniel entered a few moments later and chose a seat beside me instead of beside his wife. Rachel noticed immediately. It was the first time during our marriage that my son had publicly stood on my side. She looked away without saying a word. Judge Evelyn Brooks entered, and the courtroom rose. After everyone was seated, the judge looked toward Rachel's attorney. "Are both parties prepared?" "Yes, Your Honor." The hearing began with Rachel's attorney arguing that she had acted only out of concern for my health. He described me as a grieving widower whose judgment had become unreliable after years of loneliness. As he spoke, Rachel lowered her head and wiped away what appeared to be tears. It was a convincing performance. Several people in the gallery even looked sympathetic. Then Richard stood. He didn't raise his voice or make dramatic accusations. Instead, he quietly placed a single laptop on the evidence table. "Your Honor," he said, "before discussing opinions, I'd like the court to examine facts." Susan Miller was sworn in as an expert witness. She explained how she recovered the files from Rachel's damaged laptop, how every step followed forensic procedures, and how the digital metadata proved the recordings had been edited before being shown to the physician. One by one, the original videos appeared on the courtroom screen beside the edited versions. Every missing sentence, every deleted response, every altered timeline became impossible to ignore. The courtroom grew quieter with each comparison. Judge Brooks watched without interrupting. When the final video ended, she slowly removed her glasses and looked toward Rachel, "Mrs. Thompson." Her voice remained calm. "Did you knowingly present edited recordings during a medical evaluation?" Rachel opened her mouth, but no answer came. Her attorney quietly whispered something, urging her not to respond. The judge nodded once. "Very well." Richard then called Daniel to the witness stand. My son walked forward with trembling hands. After taking the oath, he looked briefly at Rachel before facing the judge. "Your Honor," his voice cracked. "Everything my father said was true." The room became completely silent. Daniel admitted signing documents without reading them. He admitted believing Rachel's explanations. He admitted staying silent when I was forced to eat alone in the garage because he was afraid of destroying his marriage. Finally, he looked toward me. I thought avoiding conflict would protect my family. Tears filled his eyes. Instead, I became part of the reason my father lost his. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't look away. Daniel had finally stopped hiding from the truth. Rachel suddenly stood. "That's enough," she shouted. "He only changed his story because Harold manipulated him." Judge Brooks struck the gavel. "Mrs. Thompson, sit down." Rachel ignored the order. She pointed directly at me. "He turned everyone against me. Richard poisoned Daniel. That so-called expert destroyed my life." Susan remained silent. Richard didn't react. Daniel simply lowered his head. Rachel realized too late that she was standing alone. Judge Brooks waited until the courtroom became quiet again, before reading from the recovered planning document. Step 1. Isolate Harold. Step 2. Medical evaluation. Step 3. Temporary guardian. Step 4. Complete refinance. Step 5. Sell property after 6 months. She closed the file. "Mrs. Thompson, this document was recovered from your personal laptop. Do you deny creating it?" Rachel looked toward her attorney. He slowly lowered his eyes. He couldn't help her anymore. After several long seconds, Rachel whispered, "No." It was the first truthful word she had spoken in months. Judge Brooks took a slow breath before announcing her ruling. The temporary guardianship petition was dismissed with prejudice. Every refinancing application connected to my property was declared void. The court ordered the evidence forwarded to the district attorney for criminal prosecution, involving attempted financial exploitation, document fraud, and evidence manipulation. As deputies approached Rachel, she finally looked at me. "Was it worth it?" she asked quietly. I looked at Lily, who was sitting beside Daniel in the front row holding the same stuffed rabbit from Christmas. Then I looked back at Rachel. This was never about the house. I paused. It was about making sure my granddaughter grows up knowing that the truth is worth defending, even when it's painful. Rachel lowered her head as the deputies escorted her from the courtroom. No one applauded. No one celebrated. Outside, snow began falling across the courthouse steps. Daniel walked beside me in silence until we reached my truck. Before getting in, he handed me a small wrapped box. "I found this in Mom's old closet," he said. Inside was the tiny wooden ornament Mary had carved during our very first Christmas in that house. On the back, in her familiar handwriting, were 6 simple words. "A home is built with love." I held the ornament in my hand for a long time before carefully placing it in my pocket. The house was still standing. The family was broken, but for the first time since Mary was gone, I believed it could someday become a home again.